This is Chapter 13, Measuring the Economy's Performance. Discussion number 4, the business cycle. We're going to take a look at one of the more important concepts of macroeconomics, and that is the business cycle. Now, what we have seen over the course of centuries is that economies on a national scale and even on an international scale don't steadily do the same thing. That we go through times of economic expansion, wealth creation, and everyone's living great, and then we go through times of economic stagnation where things start falling apart, people are losing their jobs, and there's not being a lot of wealth being produced, and things like that. And it took a long time for economists to be able to measure these type of ideas, but when they did, they started seeing this type of thing that they can graph. Now, as we look at slide 11 here, we see that what I have graphed here is from essentially what our business cycle has looked like in the United States from the early 1900s to about the beginning of the 1980s. And what the business cycle means is essentially how these things have changed over time as far as the country's productivity. Now, one of the things that we're going to want to make sure that we understand is the idea of capacity. What can actually be produced by an economy versus what actually is being produced. Now, this graph is going to have several different parts labeled, and I want to make sure that you do need to have this in your notes. So make sure that you leave plenty of space that you can have these different parts labeled. Maybe look ahead, or actually if you've gone to what I've actually suggested to you, you've already written the notes out. And if you didn't put the graph in now, as we're going to be labeling these parts. Now, when the economy is at its worst point, it is called the trough. And we see that I have a couple of troughs being pointed at in this graph. Now, you never really know that you hit the trough until the economy starts improving. So we're going to just start with the trough as a point to discuss. Now, one thing I also want you to see here is that this line is actually considered to be an irregular change because it's not a steady rhythm of how it happens. It is irregular in how it does change. So the trough is the very bottom. The economy just did not get any worse at that point, and that it's going to improve. Now, when it starts going up, we're going to call that the recovery or the expansion phase. This is where the economy is improving. This is where the economy is creating more jobs and more stuff and more services and all these positive ideas that people like thinking about when we talk about the economy. However, when the economy starts really moving fast and a lot of things are being produced, there's going to be opportunities for not so great things to also come with that economic performance. For example, inflation will be picking up. There may be a competition for employment. For example, people might be so desperate to get employees to feed the expansion that eventually you might run out of available persons for those jobs. And so we start running into where the economy is working at peak performance. It just really is not going to get any better at that point. And then there's going to be some economic reasons, and we'll get into them later, that will cause the economy to decrease in its productivity. When we reach that top point, just like at the trough, we never really know until it starts coming up. The peak, the very top of that, is where we don't really realize that we've gotten to the top until it starts coming down. Now, when it starts coming down, we call that the contraction, where there's going to be less jobs available, so it's contracting the amount of jobs available. There's going to be less productivity. There's going to be less wealth creation during the contraction points. And so as you see, as the lines are coming down on these different areas of the business cycle graph, that's what we call the contraction. Now, there's going to be other terms as well that I'm pretty sure that you're going to be more familiar with, and that is the idea of the recession or a depression. Now, officially, economists have said that if the GDP is negative or has negative growth for more than 2 quarters, that's half a year, it's officially a recession. Now, they really haven't come up with an exact term for depression, but if it's really severe or if it lasts a long time, that contraction period, it is considered to be a depression. Now, remember I told you the line graph that we're looking at is from the early 1900s all the way to about the mid 1980s. And we see that we have lots of, it goes up, down, up a little bit to that white line is considered to be zero. And then we see that we have tremendous negative growth. And that obviously is the Great Depression after the in the 1930s. And then we have severe negative growth, but then we start picking up and we have this huge upswing going up through World War II, and then the 1950s. And then we have negative. Want you to make sure that you realize though that even though the line's going down, we still have positive growth because that red line never really gets below the 0 point. Now, granted, we might have gotten used to 8%, 10% growth, or even 12% growth, which is where I think that top of that peak is in the 1950s, but we still had a little bit of growth, and then we grew up a little bit more, and then grew a little bit slower, and then grew some more, and that we never really hit negative growth again until the 1970s, which is again that where I have that contraction line pointing to getting toward the very end of that curve. So that's kind of what we're talking about though. So that the last part of the contraction that's when we did have a recession, because it did last for longer than 6 months. So what causes the business cycle? What makes these things change so much? Well, one reason might be innovations. The advent of the computer brought a tremendous amount of economic growth. Uh, Transportation and the railroads brought a tremendous amount of growth. The car brought a tremendous amount of growth. And so these innovations allowed for higher rates of productivity. And so that would bring that economy wide. Government policies can also make a difference. One of the things that is blamed for a lot of the depressions that we've had over the course of our economy has been due to government taxation or tariffs or things of that variety. Wars and disasters actually, in the immediate, can cause a recession, but for the most part, wars and disasters can cause a tremendous amount of growth. I mean, think first of all, in the military sense, all the weapons that you have to produce, that would be counted in the GDP, and all the bullets and everything else would go into it. And then after everything is destroyed, you've got to rebuild it, and so that also does it. But another fascinating idea is the idea that these depressions, recessions, and expansions are more psychological. That people will get worried about the economy, and as people get worried about the economy, they'll stop spending money. And as more people stop spending money, then all of a sudden people aren't going to be able to have jobs for being producing stuff because it's all sitting on the shelves not doing anything. And then the business owner said, well, gee, no one's buying our stuff. We're going to have to lay people off, and then more people hold on to their money. And so it's almost like a perception of what's really going on in the economy before, and then that starts the ball rolling. And when people have good feelings, something great's happening, and they start spending money, and then people are spending money, let's start hiring people, and it gets better and better and worse. And so those are some ideas that can sometimes kind of push or pull us through the business cycle. This concludes discussion number 4, the business cycle, as part of the Chapter 13 discussions on measuring the economy's performances.